Are you getting pressure from finance to justify or reduce your cloud bill? CloudZero is the only cloud cost platform loved by engineers and trusted by finance. CloudZero can identify unused, idle, or over-provisioned resources, alert you to spend anomalies, and organize 100% of your spend into a framework that mirrors your business structure, like cost per customer, product feature, or team. It's the most powerful platform ever built to provide accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. Manage cost, optimize development, and maximize profit, all in one platform. Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. Visit today to experience immediate and ongoing savings on your cloud bill.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another Sunday Perspective show as we creep towards the middle of February 2024. Hope everybody's doing well. I know a lot of folks are going to be listening to this on a Sunday, the day of the Super Bowl here in the United States. Lots and lots of people watch that both here in the States and around the world. So hopefully, whether you're tuning in for football or tuning in for Taylor Swift, you'll enjoy the game. Whether you are getting ready for potentially Valentine's Day with your significant other, the person you love, some sort of plans you have around that. But hopefully a little Sunday Perspective jumps in there somewhere. I want to talk about kind of one of these Sunday Perspectives where, somewhere during the week or the weeks ahead, some sort of data point pops up and we try and make a little bit of sense of it. And as I was digging into this more and more, there's just a lot of weirdness around this one. So where this kind of got started for me, and we'll dig into this in the second part of the show, was listening to a new podcast that popped up in my tech feed. It's called the BG2 podcast. It is a couple of very well-known Silicon Valley venture capitalists just starting off a podcast. The two of them are talking about a whole bunch of topics in the industry. And one of the things that they were talking about was the recent kind of trend of the big cloud providers making very, very large investments in things like OpenAI and Anthropic and some of the very big AI model building companies. And their point was, essentially, this feels a little bit different. They essentially were saying, how is the VC world measuring or trying to figure out the valuations of AI companies? And they were having a hard time doing that because so much of the AI world right now feels a little bit askew towards some of these really big models, i.e. the Anthropics and OpenAIs and Mistrals and some of these others. So they were trying to figure out, how does that work? And then they were kind of bemoaning the idea that while VCs typically have to go out and raise funding, and then that funding is invested into these various companies, that the cloud providers were in essence using less of a cash investment and more of cloud credits. So in essence, we invested $4 billion, but really only say $500 million of that is in cash, and the other $3.5 billion is in cloud credits. And so there was a lot of discussion about, what does that mean to the industry? What does that mean in terms of valuation of these companies? And valuation of the companies mostly is only relevant to the company themselves and to VCs. It's not necessarily relevant to you and I other than headlines. But they did sort of, kind of then get into this question of, is it a good thing for the cloud providers to be giving away cloud credits, and then as those credits are renewed, claiming those credits as both an investment, but also more importantly, a set of revenue, right? So a new set of revenue coming in. So that was kind of the beginning of me thinking about this stuff. And then, a whole bunch of other things happened around cloud investments and people looking for money around GPUs and around AI. And so it kind of made me think about, okay, how do we connect the dots on some of these things? Because it does feel like as much as everybody's talking about AI, and it feels like it's overwhelming the conversation in our industry right now, which it is for good reasons and other reasons. It almost feels like the funding and the cost of AI and sort of some of the interesting dynamics happening around it are maybe not getting as much play as they should. So I thought what I would do in the second part of the show is sort of dig into, kind of pull at a bunch of threads that are starting to emerge and starting to come together and ultimately, what feels like the beginning of a bunch of kind of rules and frameworks kind of getting rejiggered, if you will, reframed, restructured, whatever the right word is. I kind of want to dig into that after the break. Transform your business with Microsoft Azure, the one-stop shop for everything cloud and AI. With Azure Migrate and Modernize, move your existing workloads to Azure with ease. With Azure Innovate, build new solutions with focused and deep engagement. Their core offerings provide comprehensive resources, expert assistance, and cost optimization tools. Accelerate your cloud journey and stay ahead of the competition with Microsoft Azure. Visit aka.ms/Azure Hero Offerings to learn more. That's aka.ms/Azure Hero Offerings to learn more. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we want to dig into kind of what feels like some very interesting different threads, different data points that are kind of popping up, and what feels like the beginning of maybe some remaking of where's money coming from in our industry as it relates to AI. How is it being used and spent in terms of model building versus company building and so forth? And what are some of the kind of limiting factors or things that are starting to emerge that may have very, very large term ramifications, right? So I'm going to throw out a couple of data points or a couple of kind of instances, and we'll try and connect the dots between them. And I think quite honestly, this may be the first of what'll probably be a whole bunch of conversations that we'll want to have around the way that AI is being, is being funded in essence throughout the industry. Because ultimately, one of the things that we've done over the last 10 plus years on this show is we've really, not only tried to highlight the technologies that are emerging in cloud computing, but just as importantly, trying to paint a pretty good picture or get a very good understanding of where's the money coming from in this industry. And I know for a lot of people, talking about money and revenue and profits and all that stuff kind of turns them off, and that's fine, right? If you're kind of tuning into the show purely as a technologist, that's fine. Aaron and I have always sort of guided or said, hey, as much as you are trying to wrap your head around technology, apply technology, learn your skills, it does you at least a certain amount of good to understand the economics of your industry. Because if you don't understand at least the basics of the economics around the industry, especially at that time, you potentially leave yourself vulnerable to situations in which you fall in love with the technology, you believe the technology is going to be really impactful for whatever you do. And if you don't understand the economics of it, you can find yourself very quickly kind of getting blindsided by this love of the technology and not understanding that the technology and the economics don't line themselves up, and that one or the other may quickly disappear or crash or not behave in the way that you expected. So anyways, I use that as sort of, caveat emptor, beware. And anyway, so here's the things that kind of I've been noodling around in my brain. So we have this huge amount of investment by the three large cloud providers and probably more so, other cloud providers as well, in not just GPUs. We've all kind of seen the numbers in terms of, how many GPUs that the various cloud providers are buying, right? We've got, Facebook talking about having a 600,000 GPU farm, and the cloud providers having, 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 GPUs, and, making these massive investments. Obviously, right now, NVIDIA is the biggest beneficiary of all of that. We expect that'll evolve over time, right? We've started to see some of the cloud providers talk about even building their own GPUs. Azure's already talking about building their own GPUs and so forth. But we've got this huge investment by the cloud providers, not only in GPUs, but also because for the most part, they don't necessarily build their own models. And that's not, completely true. Google obviously has been in the model building business for a long time, probably more so than anybody else. Microsoft is investing in OpenAI heavily. Amazon has some of their own models, but they've also kind of feels like they've sort of, I don't know if they acknowledge, but they've sort of acknowledged they're a little bit behind. So they're investing in people like Anthropic and other stuff like that. So we have both massive investment in GPUs, mostly benefiting NVIDIA. We've got massive investment in the models themselves. And what's interesting is the investment in GPUs obviously has to be driven by cash and cash reserves, and probably going through a certain amount of what the CPU vendors went through, during the last 10 plus years, where the cloud providers were placing orders and they were rapidly consuming them, not necessarily paying for them right away, and probably getting into different sort of different ways of paying for them. It'll be interesting to see how they're paying for the GPUs. Obviously, NVIDIA would probably like them to be all be paid for up front. We'll see. And the reason I mention that is because we are starting to see some reports come out from various places that the GPUs, while they're available and people are reserving them, they're not necessarily being utilized at high rates. And to a certain extent, this is probably to be expected because a lot of this stuff is still somewhat new. But it's interesting because, again, we would think of the GPUs as being such incredibly valuable resources that people would try to utilize them to the greatest extent. And so there are a bunch of links in the show notes to various reports that are starting to say, well, maybe the GPUs aren't necessarily being as highly utilized. And the reason that's being said is because if they were as utilized as people would expect them to be, the cloud revenues would be higher than they would be. Anyway, so another data point about the cloud revenues. Now, what's interesting and what got me starting about this was, as I mentioned, this podcast is BG2 podcast, which was a bunch of VCs kind of bemoaning the idea that they were kind of being cut out of the loop to a certain extent in terms of investing in these high-flying, high-gravity companies, the Anthropics, the OpenAIs, the big model builders, and that the way that they were being funded was sort of in cloud credits from the cloud providers. And obviously that gets interesting because the cloud providers, being part of very, very large companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, have access to a certain extent to huge, huge amounts of cash. They've been hoarding cash for many, many years. They've got huge cash reserves. But instead, they are, essentially making these investments with cloud credits, right? So I'm giving you $4 billion, but essentially, $3.5 billion of that, for example, is in you directly utilizing my service. And it's really an interesting way of going about funding it, because not only does it allow them probably to do a couple of things. Number one, they get to take an equity position many times in these companies, right? So they're investing in the future. They're getting near-term revenues back for that pseudo investment, right? Like the money didn't really actually leave them. And, they already have this investment, which is depreciating, and it's helping them accelerate the depreciation of it. So it gets into some really interesting sort of economics and math and accounting and so forth as to, what do these investments look like? And they look very different than the risk that venture capitalists take, in which, they're not necessarily getting their money back right away. So that part was very interesting. I think it has some interesting ramifications as we do our normal sort of cloud news of the week, cloud news of the month stuff, or what'll be cloud news of the quarter as we look at the cloud revenues. We're already starting to see the cloud providers talk about the revenue bump that they're getting from AI, but it does. For example, so Microsoft's Q2 2024 earnings report states that AI services contributed 6 percentage points of growth to Azure revenue. This is an increase from 3 percentage points in the previous quarter. So this is a quote from the recent Microsoft earnings. And it does make you sort of wonder, when we start talking about AI growth in the cloud, are we going to be talking about growth from customers? So meaning like not OpenAI training their models, which technically is a customer of Azure, but it's not JP Morgan, it's not Ford, it's not Boeing, it's not Barclays or HSBC or anybody along those lines. So it would be interesting to start and watch and see, do we see these numbers popping out in the earnings calls from cloud providers, but yet maybe not clarification of who exactly is utilizing all these GPUs, who's doing all this quote unquote AI that's propping up the numbers for the cloud providers. So I think that's going to be an interesting sort of thing to watch is, will we be able to figure out the granularity between essentially the renewal of these investment credits, cranking out, trying to build bigger models, faster models, and so on and so forth, more capable models, or are they actually sort of second order downstream, actual end customers utilizing the AI services or building applications that then touch these models and so forth. So I think that's going to be really interesting to watch. The other thing second thing that's interesting is, what happens to VC investment? Because we all know there is huge pent-up demand to be involved in the AI space, to be investing in the AI space, right? Sort of, we've mentioned this many times. It feels like the next computing era. It feels like sort of the next gold rush in computing. But, will we see the VC community be able to participate at the level that they want to? Will we start to see the cloud providers, sort of through their VC arms, if you will, their own internal VC arms, basically saying, hey, this is a great model. Let's start cutting out the VCs, right? Let's go directly to these technologies. Let's offer cloud credits. Let's sort of build this flywheel in which, you're not having to chase money. We're providing this thing. We're able to utilize our resources more. We're able to depreciate them. So it does feel a little bit like we might be at the beginning of sort of a new VC framework. And it'll be interesting to sort of dig into, what does that look like from a risk perspective? What does that look like from a partnership perspective with the cloud providers? Because obviously, companies and startups have a certain relationship with VCs. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. What does that look like in terms of, working with the cloud provider? Is that a good thing? Because not only are they providing you credits, is it a bad thing because they're not providing you as much cash? So maybe you're more constrained in terms of the number of people you can hire, or what you can pay your data scientists. That'll be interesting to watch. Obviously, the VCs don't necessarily have any go-to-market path to help you with that. The cloud providers, obviously have cloud, partner go-to-market paths and partner joint programs and marketplaces and stuff. So that seems like it would be sort of beneficial more for the cloud provider than a traditional VC. But I think that space is going to be really, really interesting to watch is, how much investment do we see from them? And then how do the cloud providers, if they go down this path, how do they manage sort of the conflicts of interest that might arise or the, sort of prioritization that might arise from getting access to these GPUs, their go-to-market paths and all those sort of things. So that becomes sort of interesting. Now, the third thing that I thought was sort of interesting, and this again popped up here in this last week, and this is one of those articles that you read and you think like, this seems a little bit crazy, and so your red flags sort of go up, your spidey sense sort of goes up. But there's an article out there floating around that Sam Altman, who is at least wearing one hat, the CEO of OpenAI. We talked about Sam for the year end, and he had a little bit of bumpiness at OpenAI, but seems to be back at OpenAI. And the articles that are being written and the things that are floating around is that he is seeking up to $7 trillion for this sort of new chip concept of whatever he's trying to do. So he's basically saying, look, in order for us to achieve these massive AI goals, we're going to need far greater GPU capacity than the world provides today, and is out, going to all sorts of investment vehicles from nation states and sovereign wealth funds to VCs and so forth, and allegedly is looking for up to $7 trillion. And the reason I bring this up is it's interesting sort of headline fodder, and it's a gigantic number. I mean, it's an insane number. There's actually a tweet that's floating around that I put a link to in the show notes, that sort of says, these are the companies that if this amount of money was raised, who they could buy. NVIDIA, TSMC, Broadcom, ASML, Samsung, AMD, Intel, Qualcomm, Applied Materials, Texas Instruments, Lam Research, ARM, Analog Devices, Micron, KLA, Foxconn, Marvell, and MediaTek, all these companies in the chip sector, and you'd still have $1.5 trillion left over. So buying up all those companies, essentially the entire chip market is about $5.5 billion or 5 point something billion. And he's kicking around these ideas of trying to raise nearly $7 trillion. So anyways, the reason this was sort of interesting is, not from the sort of eye candy or clickbaitiness of, how big it is or the title. But it does make you wonder, the last time we've seen these kind of crazy ambitions about raising insane amounts of money were, in the sort of WeWork or Uber sort of things where somebody who was believed to be sort of the, this visionary of this segment of the industry, essentially saying, there are no rules in this new game that I'm going to create. There are no laws. There are no national priorities. There are no nothing, but I'm going to need so much money to go about doing this. And it's interesting in that so much of this money is being raised, is it being raised aligned to OpenAI? Is it being aligned to something outside of OpenAI such that Sam is, kind of trying to get outside of that vacuum and saying, hey, I don't necessarily want to own the greatest model. I want to own the chipsets. I want to own the pickaxes and the shovels. So anyways, I thought that was interesting as well. And so, when we put all those sort of three things together in terms of the VC industry feels like it's being disrupted a little bit in terms of sort of their traditional model. The cloud providers are starting to try and control their own destiny, but they're doing it in sort of interesting, novel, and maybe not good financial ways. We'll see. And then, you have some overblown kind of ambitions, grandiose ambitions to completely change the market. And the reason that one's interesting is because, what Uber and eventually Lyft and so forth did to, things like ride sharing, like, is there a correlation there between that and this gigantic ask of, funding for something that's, sort of chips, essentially infrastructure for, huge swaths of what could become AI? Like, is it too much and so forth? So anyways, I just thought those three things were sort of interesting. They do feel like, people trying to look at the big map of things and going, I don't know if I like the map anymore. I don't know if I like the game. I have these ambitions for what the world could be. And in order to get there, we're essentially going to have to, spend more time with the eraser than we will with the pen or the Sharpie, erasing sort of the lines of the old games, the old expectations, the old models, and basically redrawing them with something new. So anyways, I think it's going to be very interesting to sort of start to think about how this all comes together. Obviously, on this show, we will do a bunch to do our best to cover the technology as we've always done. But I think we will, do just as much in terms of trying to make sure we understand the economics and get ahead of it. Because I think, we're beginning to watch AI blossom. We kind of fully believe in the thesis that this is the beginning of the AI era. But again, every era is dictated both by technology, but also by economics and debt and interest rates and all those sort of things. And so it'll be very interesting for us to kind of watch all that unfold. So anyways, just don't necessarily have a final conclusion for today's show, but just some things that we're really thinking about from a Sunday perspective as opposed to a Sunday conclusion. So anyways, thank you all for listening. Hope your February is going well. Hope whoever you are rooting for in the Super Bowl, whether it's the football game or Taylor Swift or something else, goes well for you. And hopefully your February is going well as the days begin to be a little bit longer in terms of daylight, start to warm up a little bit, and hopefully everybody's starting to get outside a little bit. So anyways, with that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for clicking on the subscribe button. Thanks for downloading the show and listening to it regularly so it stays up to date in the charts and continues to get downloaded for you. So with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.